Okay, welcome to Sallay Talks, the Sallay Academy podcast. I'm Sela Warnicki. I'm the literature and English language teacher for Sallay, one of them. And today we have a guest with us, a very talented journalist, Kat Lister. And we are going to be talking a little bit about how journalism is important in teaching critical thinking skills. Kat, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for having me. As Sela rightly pointed out, my name is Kat Lister and I am a journalist, a freelance journalist and an author. My first book, which is a memoir, came out last September with a small publishing house called Icon Books, called The Elements of Widowhood. Which is all about my first year of widowhood. My husband died of a brain tumour 4 years ago, and after his death I began exploring grief in numerous different ways, one of which was this book, but before this book came out and before I became a published author, I am a journalist, a jobbing journalist. I've been doing this for 15 years. I started out as a music journalist, so I started out freelancing on the news desk at the New Musical Express, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's an iconic title. And I went on to write features and still do for a broad selection of both websites, digital journalism and print still. So I write features for monthly magazines, broadsheet supplements and different websites. So titles include The Observer magazine, Sunday Times magazine, The Guardian. I've done pieces for Vogue, investigative journalism for Vice. So lots of fingers in different pies, and really looking forward to talking about the dizzying world of journalism and where we are in 2022.
Thank you so much, Kat. Yes, we're really honored to have you and your vast range of experience. So we wanted to kind of think about a few questions today. And the first, perhaps we can start with addressing kind of what is the media landscape that that we're dealing with, because so much has changed. So much has changed in the years that you've been a journalist. So yes, what's been your experience of this?
Well, possibly I am a good person to talk to about this, because I think, we're talking about a general landscape, but actually talking as an individual journalist who started, I would say, mid-noughties, and at that time around sort of 2004, 2005, social media as we know it now, and platforms such as Twitter and TikTok didn't exist. And if they did, they had a different emphasis, and they weren't the powerful platforms that we know them to be now. So when I started in journalism, the landscape was very different, which is mad because it was only 15 years ago, not that long. And in the space of just over a decade, my job has changed, the demands have changed, but also audiences have changed in terms of what they expect from journalists, what they expect from what they read, the news that they consume, the features that they hope will inform them. I would say issues of maybe trust and skepticism have come to play more recently, especially, I'd say from 2006, and Trump coming to power, and talking about, what we now refer to as sort of post-truth politics, alternative facts.
Terrifying phrase, isn't it?
These terms are now, we're all familiar with them. Nobody is ignorant to what they mean. But it has meant that I think nowadays, journalists have to defend what they do in the same ways that maybe a politician would, which I think maybe even 15 years ago wouldn't have been the case. When I was, for instance, when I was on the news desk at NME, I wasn't on Twitter. Twitter was just starting out, but I wasn't involved, and also Twitter wasn't involved in the world of journalism at that point. It was a place to go for entertainment and quippy one-liners. It wasn't a place to go for news. It wasn't a news source. We didn't have these kind of like breaking news tweets back then, which now just seems crazy, because that's where a lot of us do go to and that is where news is broken now, generally speaking.
Yeah, and it's where politicians and leaders and people go to make announcements, isn't it? So it's a completely unmediated form. You mentioned Trump, yeah. Of course, the world's most infamous Twitter user, probably.
Yes.
So given this, and given the torrents of information, everything that people have available, how do you establish credibility, and how can students, how can young people kind of navigate in this complex world?
I'll be perfectly honest, it's very hard. It's very hard even for those who are in the industry and working in the industry to navigate such a fast changing landscape. And I don't think there's any one person who is doing it perfectly. I think that the way that we learn and grow and familiarize ourselves is by having conversations like this, which is to be very open about the downfalls of social media, but also what the positives are, and what we can glean from it, and how we can. It's not going anywhere. None of these platforms are going anywhere. The only thing that can change is our relationship with it. And that can seem, especially right now, quite chaotic. It can be a hard place to navigate. It can be a hard place to verify what is news and what is, fake news, as we call it. There was a big kind of pushback against, well, it had a hashtag, MSM, which was extremely hurtful to a lot of us journalists to see that take almost snowball in a way that I think it sort of caricatured the press and lumped everyone together. So anyone writing and working for a mainstream title was hashtag MSM and wasn't to be trusted. That was quite difficult to navigate. But I think the best way that we can make our way through this is to think about the original source. Like, where does, you see a video shared a gazillion times on Twitter, immediately, because you see those numbers, that almost verifies it in your mind. And actually that's not the asset to look at.
The numbers aren't quite enough, are they?
No. Often I have to, double check myself, because I will be almost hitting that retweet, and then I'll be like, hang on a second, who filmed that video? Where was it filmed? Are the details correct? Is the date right? Contextualizing tweets or videos on TikTok or wherever you happen to find yourself is incredibly important, because what we're talking about is almost like we've all become fact checkers in a way, and that's an incredible responsibility. And there's a responsibility not on the content creators, but there's also now a responsibility on the readers or the audience, as we were saying, to look at things more critically. And I think now more than ever that's become quite urgent, and it's not something that any of us are doing in a perfect way, I don't think.
No, but when you say that verification process, it's a very traditional journalism, right? It's the 5 W's: the who, what, why, where, when. And I think that's something that as a teacher, as a literature teacher, I really emphasize, continually asking students, okay, what's the context of this, whether it's an article or, a short story, make sure you understand where this is coming from. And it sounds like you're saying that there's a direct relationship between that kind of critical reading of anything and the ability to navigate. the news?
Well, yeah, because we're talking about important stories, rolling stories. We're talking about breaking news, live events. I think a really good example of this is the recent war in Ukraine. At least to me, it seems to underline a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of where we go for our news and how we critically absorb that. And there were two very interesting articles that came out about the war in Ukraine and social media mere weeks after Putin's invasion. And one of them was a Vice piece that was talking about, they called it the memification of war, which is the ways in which TikTok, which is a relatively new social media platform, and it's radically altering how other older social media platforms such as Instagram and Facebook are adapting. So they were exploring how a lot of memes were coming out almost immediately, like warfare memes, real news that were being adapted and sometimes manipulated into more entertaining reels, and taking on Marvel superhero narratives, almost turning it into a computer game, or what one would, recognize to look like a computer game. The borrowing of narratives, it's almost like the borrowing of fairy tales transposed onto real news. So I think that the blurring of lines between fact and fiction has never been more obvious to me now, with some of the news stories that are happening at the moment. And another article that was very interesting in relation to Ukraine is an amazing New Yorker piece. And they called the war in Ukraine the first TikTok war, in terms of, everyone was actually now going to TikTok, or a lot of TikTok users were looking for Ukraine news stories on a platform that traditionally we've seen as merely entertainment, somewhere to go for funny videos, or maybe a cookery reel, is now being used in a different way, which is fascinating. And I don't think there's any journalist working right now that isn't looking at this very closely and thinking, how can we adapt to this? And but not only adapt as a more traditional media format, but how can we respond to this, and what do we have to say? And so it's very interesting. There's a couple of mainstream titles that have been responding to this. So The Guardian has been doing a series called Fake or For Real, and they're going on Instagram and they're doing stories that so that they're taking certain stories, fake news stories, and teaching younger audiences, as we were saying, how to recognize or how to look for maybe inconsistencies in something that you're seeing on social media, which is an example of how traditional media is trying to start up a conversation,
trying to kind of address this world, right? Which it's interesting. I mean, once upon a time, sort of being mainstream media meant credibility, and now it's almost the opposite of that, right? So there has to be this new way of adapting. And I mean, what kind of clues does a reader need to look for in a story? We talked a little bit about the fact-checking aspect, but what are some kind of giveaways of unreliable news?
God, that's a really tough question. I would say, when I'm looking at, say, a picture or a video, or someone's put together a reel, I will be thinking about my main ports of call are sources, and trying to find out sort of the origins of a story. Who's being interviewed is very important. So, like, the chain, I would say, is something that I would look at. Who has this journalist gone to talk to? Is it merely a one-sided story? has any, you know, is there a counterbalance
Are there too?
Yeah, because you know, you go on Fox News and you don't get that, and I think audiences have become maybe a little familiar with that now, that they're looking to be told something, which actually journalism should be showing something, right? So yes, I mean, traditionally, if you're having, there's a news story where, you know, you're just being updated on the facts, that's one thing, but something that's more explorative, investigating something, or exploring a news story and showing sort of, you know, the multifaceted nature of one thing that's happening. You're looking for a variety of voices. What kinds of voices? I would, you know, how much effort has this writer gone into really researching and giving a rich analysis of a particular topic?
Okay. And obviously, once someone publishes something, journalists are also on social media. So do you kind of follow fellow journalists, and do you kind of anticipate your audience coming to your accounts? And
well, I mean, the anxiety is always there, and I'm not alone with that. And some journalists are more anxious than others. Twitter absolutely terrifies me. I'm on it. I'm on it because I have to be. It's part of my job. It's a way to engage with other writers and editors. It's a way that I get commissioned. You're being heard on Twitter, but you're also listening to others, gauging a sense of like whether the political thermometer is,
right,
getting a sense of what others think. It gives you good contextualization, I think. But I have to admit that I find it abrasive most of the time. I'm quite sensitive. I'm quite a sensitive writer. And I don't always feel like I am well matched for it's quicksilver. It's very fast moving. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm like the quippiest of writers. I'm more of a slow burner, long form journalist. Other journalists have taken to Twitter like a duck to water because they are good at that, and they are very good at giving very fast analysis. The problem with that is once it's out there, it does its thing, as we know. I mean, tweets can go viral very quickly. And I think sometimes, especially with a breaking news story, I will try and sort of, I take some time before I rush to Twitter to voice an opinion. And to be honest with you, I don't always do that. I try and save it for a more longer form piece of journalism than tweeting something. What's interesting about Twitter is I think it has influenced criticism, critical journalism, I would say. So a lot of journalists are quite nervous and anxious these days, that we talk a lot about cancel culture, and I think that's a whole other podcast in of itself. A lot of journalists are very scared of being cancelled for making an error or a mistake, or being jumped on by readers. So I think journalists have maybe responded to that a little bit, and I think some of us are a little bit more nervous in terms of sort of being your 100% absolute honest selves. Many are wrestling with that, and I think that's an ongoing thing. And that's interesting to see that like how social media is influencing how journalists respond to a story, and maybe has made some more cautious. But I think that's like an ongoing thing, and I think it's too early to tell sort of what direction really that's going to go in.
And do you think that kind of younger journalists and people who are students now growing up how are their expectations of privacy, of having a public image? How are these things different now that we do have so much social media and so many platforms to be heard on?
It's so hard, and I really feel for the younger generation because I have a point of contrast. Like I was saying, when I started out in journalism, none of these platforms were here. And growing up, I mean, you and I grew up when technology was having its, just major, major revolution. The revolution has happened, is happening. And I think youngsters, you know, that it's not a surprise that there's a huge mental health epidemic happening, because everything is put out there, or people feel like they need to do that. People feel like they need, like, everything must be documented now. How do you know if it happened if you don't, like, put it on your stories? And you know, that can develop through, I think, speaking from a journalistic point of view, it can feel like you always have to have an opinion on everything. And I have to remind myself that even as a journalist, you know, I have my areas of expertise, but I don't know everything. I don't know everything about anything. And sometimes it's okay to say, I don't know. And I think that sometimes can feel difficult on these platforms, to feel like you can say that freely. I think there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on people to present their curated lives, you know. Photos have a filter, you know, reels are edited. Someone can look like they're having, you know, the time of their life, and they're in a mental health breakdown. There's no way of, we're talking about verifying, there's no way of verifying really the true lives of anybody on any of these platforms. And it's certainly no way to keep connected and I don't, and this is my personal opinion, I don't think it's a way to keep connected in a real way with friends and family, for instance. You know, I wouldn't think that keeping up with somebody's Instagram account is a way of knowing truly what is happening in their internal world.
Obviously there are a lot of challenges with navigating this new media landscape, with navigating social media. But what are some of the benefits of all of this? What are some of the positive things that are emerging and have emerged in this revolution?
I don't want to feel like the old lady. Well, back in my day,
about the good stuff. Yeah.
There are lots. I think it has democratized things in a way where, you know, so many people who wouldn't have had a platform, who, you know, wouldn't have had a voice, wouldn't have had a way to communicate their thoughts, their feelings, their analysis on stories. There wouldn't have been anywhere for that to go, and therefore I think it has really opened doors for a lot of people, and that can only be a good thing. And I think a great example of that is the Black Lives Matter movement, and Donella Frazier, who was honoured with by the Pulitzer Board for filming her video of George Floyd's murder, and she posted it on Facebook, and from that one video, a whole global movement was born. So I think, you know, I don't want to be one of those people who says, like, you know, absolutely not, and it's all bad. It's not at all. I think that these platforms can be utilized in a really amazing way, that can actually, you know, affect not only what we report, but how we report it. What do you know what's a really good phrase? There's an author called Chris Kraus, and she's written several books, but there's a phrase of hers that I wrote down years and years ago, because I think it's like really potent and important. And she said, you know, who gets to speak and why? Like, that's the question. And I think that's actually very relevant to that question about the positives of social media, is that everyone gets space now. Everyone is given a space to stand up and speak, and I don't think you can turn away from that, and we won't be turning away from that. This is the present, and this is the future now.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's really important that people of all ages, but I think particularly young people, have these areas to connect, right? I mean, when I was growing up, you know, my peers were the people who lived in my town. You know, I didn't have that opportunity to maybe reach out and engage with people around my interests or around things I was curious about. And, you know, it's amazing that that we all have this opportunity now of.
Absolutely. And we're talking about gender, and we're talking about race, and we're talking about class, you know, and, you know, traditionally speaking, those who have been able to speak and write have been from very privileged backgrounds, and very similar backgrounds. And there's a real shift occurring now where, you know, we're getting now, you know, a different mix of voices, and that's what journalism really, really needs. And it's by nowhere near where it needs to be. You know, it's not. There's a long mountain to hike up. But we are talking about it now, and we recognize that there is a mountain that we need to
keep moving. Yeah,
and we're not. So I think without social media, that would be even harder.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as a teacher, one of the things I really try to instill in my students and talk about is empathy and understanding the differences in people's lives, and understanding that there are multiple perspectives to everything. And what role do you think journalism plays in this? How can it help us not just learn facts, but kind of understand more other people's worlds?
I genuinely think that it's more important now than it's ever been, and you know, the types of pieces that I write, that just comes into my journalism without thinking, because of the topics that I write about. And I have written about my own grief, and I write a lot of culture pieces. But, you know, in addition to that, I write about a lot of social issues and women's issues. And with that, you know, empathy is a word that is crucial to the work that I do. I think perhaps there's a debate now with just, you know, the politics have changed so much, and everything now seems so aggressive and so binary that I feel like that word empathy is sort of struggling to hold its own within this like ecosystem, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense anymore. You know, it feels like the rule book has been thrown out the window, and we're all trying to think about how we approach our own lives, but also approach what's happening around us in a way that makes sense, when nothing seems to make any sense right now. So a really good interview with the editor of the New York Times, Dean Backwet, and that was in the New Yorker, and he was actually asked about this, about the question of empathy, and what role does that play in telling stories. And when I say telling stories, I mean everything's a story, even a rolling news story. And it was really interesting the way that he approached it, because he was actually it was a question, but he was being challenged, because the interviewer was saying, well, with this rise in right-wing politics, maybe journalism needs to be a lot more, he used the word muscular, which I thought was an interesting turn of phrase, more challenging, you know, be maybe a bit more aggressive, a little less empathetic. And Dean said, and I'll read you the quote because I thought it was very good. He said, I don't think we should, and he was talking about Black Lives Matter at this point, I don't think we should cover racists with empathy. I think we should try to explain and have people understand how the world works so they can make their own decisions. And later on, and I think this is crucial, especially in my work as a journalist, he said, I'm being empathetic to the reader, not empathetic to the subjects. And I think that's such an interesting point of view there, and one that I think I agree with. I just think it's having a bit of a tough ride at the moment. Very obvious reasons. We're all feeling drowned by this very, very, you know, the world is literally on fire. You know, we've got global warming, you know, democracy feels like it's sort of stifling to breathe, you know, Brexit in my country. There's so much that's happening, and it can feel like perhaps from a journalistic point of view, perhaps the way to combat that is to be more aggressive in your writing. But I think I'm probably in Dean's Club.
No, I love that idea of explaining things so people can understand them, and I think this is the goal of education, and not just in schools, like of self-education, of growing and throughout our lives, staying connected and staying engaged as citizens, as human beings. We have a responsibility, really, don't we?
We do.
Journalists and the people reading or consuming the journalism to make that effort to understand.
Yeah, was it? You'll probably know this better than I do, Sela, but I think it was Margaret Atwood that said a word followed by a word followed by a word is power. And that's true. You know, language is. I mean, I would say this because I'm a writer, but language is like it's a powerful thing. We talk about the power of the pen. I mean, now we all write on laptops, but you know, this is why I struggle with Twitter myself, is because I think about words so much and the potential they hold, the ways in which that they can alter and change things, open people's eyes and minds to stories that they've never known about 10 minutes earlier. And I don't think you can take that lightly. And so I think it is challenging when you're on a platform like Twitter, where, you know, you're looking at sort of like dogs skateboarding.
Right, cats knocking things off desks.
Looking at, you know, a murder that's just taken, like, so that's what we're talking about. That's how polarizing social media is, because it is actually a reflection on society, and that's where we are. So maybe it is a truthful reflection. I don't know.
Yeah, don't always like what we see in the mirror, right? But
no.
No, I wanted to touch on one more thing, Kat, before we wrap up, and that is how new media and social media has facilitated more of a dialogue between journalists and their audience. That the journalism is no longer one-sided, and you've mentioned that being on Twitter can feel a bit intimidating for that reason. But what have you experienced? Like, what are the positives of this communication?
For me, it's been kind of, the last year it's been particularly revelatory for me. My book came out in September of last year, and actually more recently it's been sort of a steady trickle, but the last few months I've been getting more and more messages, direct messages on both Twitter, but mainly Instagram actually, from readers of my book, and more specifically grieving readers who are reading my book, and more specifically than that, widows. And I just think it's so incredible to have that direct line open, and it's not just incredible for them to be able to communicate to me that they are reading my book or have read my book, and feel like they're not alone, and they are being seen and heard, and that finally somebody is writing their story, that they are seeing their story in mine. That is not simply amazing for them, that is amazing for me as a writer. And without Instagram, I would never have been able to talk to my readers in this way. And we talk about responsibility, and I take a lot of responsibility for facilitating these conversations. But also personally, it's a real honour and a privilege to be able to speak with them. I mean, literally only yesterday I had a message from a woman who is currently reading my book, and her boyfriend died a few years ago, and he was 28 years old. And she said, you know, she's turning to books and magazines to try and find a connection in her very isolating experience. And she has done so with my book. You know, I don't care if my book gets, you know, the worst review in, well, actually I would care if it got a review in the New Yorker, but that's not what's important. What's important is getting these messages and knowing on a really profound level that you've connected, even if it's just with one person, how incredible that is, and how incredible that we're able to have that conversation. together. And the only way that has been possible is through social media. So it ain't all bad.
Definitely not all bad, for which we should be grateful, because as you say, it's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere.
No, it'll only get more interesting and more complex.
Yeah.
So I mean, what's the takeaway? I mean, it is complicated, isn't it? There are so many facets to the journalism landscape, to the media landscape that we live in. But do you have any kind of final words of advice or summation that you can?
Yeah, I think it's just, I don't want to sound incredibly California about this, but mindful, be mindful, and that's not a negative word, that's not a negative thing, it's just being aware. It's being aware of what you're reading and where it's coming from and who's writing it. Also, I just think what's really important, and this has always been important, and it's not just relevant to social media, it's relevant to any type of media, and that is just make sure you're reading and absorbing a variety of different things, different voices, making sure that you are challenging yourself. I'm a left-wing person, I read The Guardian every day, but I also make sure that I counterbalance that with reading articles by writers that I might not necessarily agree with, but that doesn't make their space less valid than mine. And I think that's really important, because my worry and my concern is that we just want to hear our own views, our own experiences. But I think it's really important, especially now, I think now more than ever, to challenge ourselves, and to be engaged, and also just don't be too scared of it. It can feel like a scary place, Twitter, and sometimes I get quite nervous on it, but I don't want to turn my back on it because it's so rich, and there are so many voices on there that to turn your back on a platform would be to turn your back on so many different points of view. So yeah, probably being mindful, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to put it. And yeah, to stay engaged and to actively look beyond one's own first inclination, right? Some say, we all have our interests, and we have the writers that we resonate with, and the things that feel comfortable and familiar. But
because it can bolster your original thought or belief. Like, it doesn't mean that by reading one thing it's going to take you off course, or actually it can be a good way of just sort of really asking yourself some important questions about what do I think about this issue, how do I feel about this particular story, and I don't think you can truly know that without reading around a topic, and making sure that you absorb as much as possible if you can.
Well, I mean, I'm always going to be 100% on board with that as a takeaway. Read more. That's something we try to encourage my students to do all the time. So I think that's if nothing else, just keep reading, keep thinking, keep being critical, and reaching out. It's great that we can send a message to a journalist or to a newspaper and engage in these ways. It's an opportunity we shouldn't take for granted.
Journalists should be held accountable in the same way that politicians do. They have a very important job, and their point of view and their words hold a lot of power. It's part of their job to sort of hold that line.
Yeah, to be answerable.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Kat, you've been an amazing guest. Thank you so much for being here with us and for sharing your insights and your experiences as a journalist.
Thank you so
It's really
much.
Great to hear from someone on the front line.
Well, and I was going to say, if you want, I'm happy to put together a little reading list of articles that I think might be interesting secondary reading if anyone would like to. So yeah.
Wow, yeah, that would be fantastic. I will be the first to to take you up on that. All right. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's joined us and listened. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation, and I hope we'll have many more challenging and interesting conversations to come.
Thank you.
Take care.